Thanks for including me in this. I don't know if this is the right angle. This is very familiar, yeah. Okay. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so this piece is called Inflatable Baby. And this is Kirby. I don't know if you guys are all familiar with Kirby from the days of classic Nintendo. All right, here we go. Emerson isn't a standard model child. He's 7 years old. At age 6, he was social and had a few friends. Now all he wants to do is play classic Nintendo and act out Nintendo moments with his collection of stuffed animals. His favorite reenactments are scenes from River City Ransom, Maniac Mansion, and especially Kirby's Adventure. At night, Emerson sleeps on the floor under a pile of his animals. He often does this in front of the TV, with the Nintendo left running. He says this gives him fun dreams, so his parents haven't forced him to sleep in bed. A 7-year-old sleeping through the night, can't argue with that. Mr. and Mrs. Wallace do worry a little. They suspect developmental issues, but all the tests have been done. No autism, which was everyone's first guess. Nothing else turned up positive. Mr. Wallace's father blames the Nintendo. It's making his brain all gooey, Grandpa Wallace says. But Mr. Wallace used to love playing classic Nintendo. And look at him now. An endocrinologist with a successful accountant for a wife, an odd yet intelligent young son, another child in the way. Mr. Wallace played classic Nintendo, and he's succeeding. Besides, he says to Grandpa Wallace, there's nothing wrong with having an overactive imagination when you're 7 years old. On Saturday morning, Mrs. Wallace is making a quiche. Lots of iron and folic acid, good for the baby, Mr. Wallace says from the kitchen table. Mrs. Wallace smiles and says something wistful about missing the locks on her bagels as Emerson runs through the door. Guess what? Guess what? I found the chainsaw fuel for the chainsaw. I've been looking forever. Honey, what on earth are you talking about? Says Mrs. Wallace. Mommy, the chainsaw in the mansion. He means in the video game, Mr. Wallace says, not lifting his eyes from the New York Times crossword. I'm going to kick this Saturday puzzle's ass, he says through gritted teeth, as pen ink leaks onto his right index finger. Emerson bounces up and down, looking to his mother for further response. Oh, I see. Well, that's great, honey. It's almost time for breakfast, though. Mrs. Wallace beckons Emerson to her, but he runs back to the Nintendo room. Mid-crossword, Mr. Wallace drops his pen and looks up to stare at nothing. Huh, that's not possible. The chainsaw fuel isn't there. Sweetie, what is it with this chainsaw? It's a red herring. The old Nintendo games always had programming glitches. Maniac Mansion had a chainsaw that you couldn't get to work because there was no fuel. But there was no fuel in the game. The programmers left it out. That used to drive me crazy. If something like that kept happening to me, I would just stop playing, Mrs. Wallace says, sliding the quiche into the oven. These games can get into your head. It's hard to stop. Mrs. Wallace rolls her eyes and sits down, rubbing her stomach. I can feel the baby. Kicking? No, almost like it's rising and falling, bobbing up and down in my uterus. Well, the baby should be getting lower. You're due next week. Mr. Wallace pauses in his crossword. I really wish we knew the sex, so there'd be no it. I hate hearing my child called an it. We'll know soon enough. And sweetie, the home birth will be fine. You know I hate hospitals. Mr. Wallace grunts in response. Silence hangs between them, until Mrs. Wallace points to an empty 9-letter entry for 13 across. An easy 2000. Simpleton. That's the word, sweetie. Mr. Wallace looks up, smiles, and kisses his wife's hand. In the Nintendo room, Emerson shouts, Chainsaw! Take that, tentacle! 3 nights later, Mr. Wallace can't sleep and paces the halls. A pink light from the Nintendo room catches his attention. Inside, the TV is on, and a giant puffball character frozen in a float, shining a bubblegum smile. In front of the TV is the usual pile of stuffed animals. Emerson's fragile puce hand protrudes from the pile at a 45-degree angle. A sudden rush of panic at not being able to see his son's face rises in Mr. Wallace's gut, and he swipes the top layer of stuffed animals from the pile. Emerson lays motionless, wreathed by fluff. The balloony character on screen maintains his floating vigil. Turning around to leave the room, Mr. Wallace is stopped by a whimpering yawn. Daddy, you didn't turn Kirby off, did you? No, Emerson, Kirby's still there. Do you want me to turn him off? No, leave him alone. I'm keeping him around for the baby. Mr. Wallace's confused expression reflects in the rosy TV screen. Emerson, why does Kirby need to be around for the baby? Emerson sits halfway up in his animal pile, blinking and looks at his father with milky sleep eyes. I want the baby to be pink and floaty like Kirby. Kirby's great, and I want a Kirby brother. We don't know if the baby is a boy yet, Emerson. What if you have a little sister? You'll need to love her just as much as a brother. Emerson shook his head. No, Daddy, it's going to be a boy. The Kirby on TV told me so. He says if I sleep here and leave him on at night, he'll make sure that my little brother is floaty like him. Mr. Wallace inhales a sharp breath. Emerson, I don't want you to be disappointed if your new brother or sister ends up looking more like you instead of Kirby, okay? Don't worry, Daddy, he won't. He'll be a Kirby baby, pink and floaty. An irate flush colors Mr. Wallace's cheeks and neck. Clenching a fist, he decides to leave the room before saying something less supportive to his son. We're all eccentric children, he thinks. It's just a phase. As he walks away, he hears Emerson saying something in a low voice. Turning his head slightly, he can see Emerson leaning forward past his stuffed animals, whispering to the TV. He closes the door. The following week, Mr. and Mrs. Wallace have the house prepared for the home birth. The midwife is present, the delivery room set, and the OBGYN alerted in case of an emergency. Mrs. Wallace's labor begins approximately on schedule, and Emerson is sequestered downstairs in the Nintendo room with one of his aunts. The TV volume is on extra loud. Kirby's giggles and whoops echo off the wall as Emerson navigates him through a game stage in Dreamland. Just as Emerson has Kirby defeat stage boss Heavy Mole, Emerson's other aunt bursts through the door. It only took her 4 hours, but the baby's here. Emerson jumps up, dropping the controller. Kirby baby! Kirby baby! He runs upstairs before either of his aunts can stop him. A victorious Kirby floats on the screen over the defeated body of Heavy Mole as both women exchange confused glances. Barreling into the delivery room, Emerson sees his mother lying prostrate in bed, covered in sheets, with a dazed smile on her face, and a very pink, wet newborn on her stomach. Mr. Wallace and the midwife stand at either side of Mrs. Wallace. Mr. Wallace puts out a hand to stop Emerson's loopy charge. Whoa, whoa, Emerson, I know you're excited, but this might not be the right time to meet your new brother. We should really cut the umbilical cord now, Dr. and Mrs. Wallace, says the midwife. It's okay, sweetie, he's already here. Let him stay and see the baby. Mrs. Wallace turns to the midwife, nodding her head. Okay, let's cut the cord. Mr. Wallace walks to open the window and let out some of the musky odor of childbirth as the midwife reaches over to begin the process of clipping and tying off the cord. Well, he's kind of pink like Kirby, says a downtrodden Emerson. Ignoring Emerson, the midwife finishes the umbilical cleaning as Mr. Wallace walks back to the bedside. What's his name? The midwife asks. George. I like George, Mrs. Wallace says, smiling up at her husband. George coos. Free of his umbilicus, he takes a sudden powerful intake of breath, puffing up to thrice his size. The air filling his little lungs lifts him from his mother's lap. Labor weakened, Mrs. Wallace shouts and makes a clumsy grasp towards her newborn son. Mr. Wallace slams into the midwife as they both lunge for the baby. Instead of hovering stationary, George quickly exhales a puff of air, then inhales, then exhales, blowing himself out the open window. Kirby baby, Emerson shouts, running downstairs, his father racing behind him, pushing the giddy boy out of his way to reach the front door first. As Mr. Wallace explodes from the house, little George can still be seen puffing his way through the sky, but soon his small body disappears in the hazy clouds, followed by an arcing flock of birds. Mr. Wallace slumps over, gasping for breath. Emerson walks to his side, clutching one of his father's fingers. I told you he'd be a Kirby baby. Thanks.